Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely fascinating, deeply complex, and, let's be honest, often wildly misunderstood. We're using our source material to explore the world of Islamic edicts, or Fatawa, specifically regarding war and peace. It's a brilliant look at legal theory. So let's just get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at the danger of unqualified rulings, how misunderstanding modern realities leads to flawed edicts, visas as sacred contracts, the trap of false historical analogies, and finally, the severity of oppression. Section 1. The danger of unqualified rulings, the medical analogy. So, to understand how Islamic law actually functions here, our source material brings up a super practical comparison. Think about it. You would never let someone perform open-heart surgery on you just because they skimmed a Wikipedia article, right? Of course not. Our source gives us this powerful hook from the Prophet Muhammad. Whoever practices medicine without any prior knowledge of medicine will be held liable. The text draws a direct, literal parallel here. An unqualified doctor, they might cause physical death, but an unqualified person issuing an erroneous fatwa on war, that can literally lead to massive societal disaster. So the crucial point is really this core concept of ijtihad. Linguistically, it comes from a root word that means striving or self-exertion. It implies a huge amount of hardship. Extracting fatwas from the Quran and Sunnah through ijtihad, that is strictly reserved for those with legitimate, recognized scholarly authority. It's not just, reading a text and taking a guess. It is the total expenditure of effort by a highly trained jurist to infer rules from incredibly detailed evidence. But here is exactly where things go completely off the rails. Experts like Mark Sagaman and Mohammed al-Yaqubi point out a stark contrast. The source explains that extremist groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda suffer from a massive, severe lack of traditional education. Sagaman actually notes that most terrorists arrive at their religious beliefs through self-instruction. A lot of them only start reading scripture seriously while sitting in prison. And al-Yaqubi adds that groups like ISIS actively rebel against established schools of Islamic law. They rely on judges who literally have no authoritative manuals and who just cherry-pick quotes to back up their own vengeful agendas. Moving on to Section 2, Misunderstanding Modern Realities, the root of erroneous edicts. You see, when individuals lack that rigorous traditional training, they don't just misread ancient texts, they fundamentally misread modern civic structures. In Islamic jurisprudence, there's this concept called manat. Basically, it means the actual on-the-ground reality of an issue. The source material is crystal clear here. If a self-appointed judge misdiagnoses the reality of a situation, the resulting fatwa isn't just a simple difference of opinion. No, it is entirely 100% legally invalid. It's kind of like a judge issuing a guilty verdict for a totally different crime. Which brings us to Section 3, Visas as Sacred Contracts, the modern covenant. Let's move to and see how this builds into the real core legal argument of our explainer regarding modern citizenship and travel. I mean, how exactly does ancient Islamic jurisprudence view a modern-day passport or a visa? Well, the source introduces the classical concept of al-amin, which translates to a binding security covenant. And in the Quran, believers are explicitly ordered to honor their covenants. So the text neutrally breaks down that, under traditional Islamic law, the modern equivalents to al-amin are things like citizenship and residency visas, meaning entering a country on a visa creates a sacred, legally binding treaty of protection. To understand why it's so incredibly binding, we have to look at contract law. Getting a residency visa actually perfectly fulfills the strict Islamic requirements of a valid contract, or AQD. It's a three-step process. First, you have an offer from the host country. Second, acceptance by the traveler. And third, the subject matter, which is entering under their security and abiding by their laws. Because it hits all these strict requirements, it absolutely, unequivocally cannot be broken. Now, you might be wondering, what about people born in a country? Some folks might try to find a loophole here, saying, well, hey, I never signed a visa or took a pledge, so I'm not bound by this, right? The source actually addresses this head-on, using a famous Sharia maxim about earth or custom. The maxim states, what is known by custom is like what is stipulated by a condition. Because society universally understands the mutual agreement of citizenship, natural-born citizens are legally just as bound to this covenant of security as naturalized immigrants. No loopholes. And what's truly fascinating and maybe a bit surprising is that the source neutrally reports how even former extremist ideologues recognize the absolute strictness of this law. Take Syed Imam al-Sharif, also known as Dr. Fadl. He actually criticized the 9/11 hijackers from his prison cell for this exact reason, because they violated the terms of their visas, which he interpreted as a direct breach of al-Aman. Similarly, Mahfouz Old al-Walid stated that visas are binding treaties of protection. meaning anyone protected by a host country is religiously prohibited from harming that host. Doing so is a massive religious transgression.
All right, on to Section 4, the historical analogy trap. Flawed kias.
So, if the rules of these contracts are so crystal clear, how do unqualified individuals justify breaking them? Well, they fall into a very dangerous legal fallacy. In Islamic law, making an analogy is called qiyas. Extremists will often make a false qiyas by taking outdated historical contexts and applying them to entirely different modern realities. And this brilliantly illustrates the problem. Our source points to a British citizen who tried to fight with the Taliban against coalition forces. He later admitted he messed up, saying he read 30-year-old Fatawa about the Soviet-Afghan War and wrongly applied them to himself today. The source clarifies that native Afghans resisting a Soviet invasion, that was a legitimate reality. But a modern citizen traveling to fight the army of their own host country, that is clear-cut treason and a total breach of the Covenant of Al-Aman. Now, it's super important to note that the source draws a very, very clear distinction when it comes to civic duty. The text states that peaceful legal opposition, like, say, protesting a war or lobbying your government to withdraw troops, is perfectly acceptable behavior, both legally and ethically. That's totally fine. The legal line is drawn strictly at armed confrontation by a citizen. That violates the sacred contract. That is treason. Finally, Section 5, the severity of oppression, the final consequence. We've spent a lot of time on the legal mechanics, but what are the ultimate moral consequences of following these erroneous edicts? The source emphasizes this with some truly powerful imagery of spiritual bankruptcy. The Prophet Muhammad once asked his companions if they knew who was truly bankrupt. And he explained that the bankrupt person isn't someone without money. No, it's someone who comes on the day of resurrection with mountains of religious rituals, prayers, fasting, charity, but who also insulted, oppressed, and shed the blood of others. The shocking consequence here is that all their good deeds are stripped away and given to their victims, rendering their lifetime of religious rituals completely void. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the profound distinction it makes between sins against the divine and sins against humanity. Quoting the classical scholar Sufyan al-Thawri, the text notes, "For you to meet Allah Almighty with 70 sins between you and Him would be easier on you than to meet Him with a single sin between you and His servants." The source explains that while God is described as all-forgiving and all-merciful, human victims of oppression, they aren't so forgiving. They will demand ultimate divine justice for the wrongs committed against them. And that brings us to our conclusion. The explainer leaves us with a really critical reflection. The source notes a famous saying, "The cure for ignorance is asking questions." But, when the consequences of following unqualified individuals involve massive societal disaster, total spiritual bankruptcy, and the breached sacred covenants, the ultimate question becomes this. When we seek to cure our own ignorance, are we making absolutely sure we are asking the right experts? It's a heavy, profound thought that really challenges us to look closely at where we derive our authority. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating source material. See you next time.